All right, kiddos, we are in Lesson 3, Section 3 of our World War I unit. So we're going to be focusing today on kind of the end of the war, but it's not really just focused on the end. That'll come, but we're going to get into kind of the course of the war later on, and then get into America getting into the war, and then the end. So it's got to actually have a lot more than just the end of the war that we're going to talk about. All right, so by 1917, European societies were really cracking under the strain of war. Casualties on the fronts and the shortages at home really that hurt morale. The stalemate dragged on seemingly without end. Soon, however, the departure of one country from the war and the entry of another would tip the balance and end the stalemate. So the first thing we need to talk about, and for you guys, this is really the first time that we see a total war, which a total war is channeling a nation's entire resources to the war effort. Okay, and so because of that, you had a massive focus on different things like supplying the war, not just materials, but men. So everything the country was focused on was focused on the war. And so that's why it's a total war. We see this in World War II, and we really don't see this again after this moment. So the next thing is recruiting and supplying these huge armies. And so a lot of countries ended up imposing what was called a conscription, or it's basically known as the draft. We still have that today. So when you turn 18, gentlemen, you have to apply for the draft. Now, we haven't had a draft since Vietnam. Not likely we will again, but it is something that we still practice in this country today. And so this ended up happening fairly early on in the war to make sure that they could keep up with the numbers that were being lost. Now, over time, you had this kind of the issue with the morale was the idea of blockades. So Great Britain had the largest navy on the planet, and they used that very well. They were focused on basically starving Germany and Austria-Hungary really from the get-go. But Germany was using submarines for the first time, submarine warfare, and really they were pretty effective in sinking not just warships but regular ships. You had a lot of really just regular ocean liners that were also carrying contraband or war materials and military supplies to help those countries out. And so one of the most famous moments that happened was the Lusitania. Some history teachers will tell you the sinking of the Lusitania brought us into the war. That has not happened. That is false. The Lusitania was sunk in 1915. We did not get into the war until a couple of years later. But it was this major moment. So what happens is Germany was not really picking and choosing who they were sinking. They were sinking everybody. And so they sank the Lusitania, which was this ocean liner. About 1,200 passengers were killed, including 128 Americans. Germany argued that the Lusitanias were carrying contraband. But that's kind of been proven, but still Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, said, no, if you want to keep us out of the war, you are going to stop sinking these things. And so really they stopped this universal warfare. And then this war is really the first time you see propaganda, which is the spreading of ideas to promote or cause a cause or to damage an opposing cause. Basically lying or focused on the negatives and things like that, or all the positives that are happening. And so each side really circulated atrocities, which are horrible acts committed against innocent people. So some atrocities did occur during this war, but it was not to the scale that we see in World War II. And so you have this kind of moment of a lot of lying taking place. Women contributed heavily to the war effort because many men were being shipped off to war. Women had to take over those jobs in order to make sure they could continue to supply everything for the war. And so you had everything from nursing to them working in manufacturing to agriculture jobs. Women contributed to the war effort heavily, and it kind of gave them a sense of purpose or being a part of the war while men were off fighting. All right, despite inspiring propaganda, by 1917 the morale of troops and civilians had plunged. Germany was sending 15-year-old recruits to the front, and Britain was on the brink of bankruptcy. And so you start with a lot of war-weary soldiers. And really what you see is what we talked about last week, living in the trenches, that trench life. It wasn't glorified war because once you got there, you just saw how terrible of a human cost this war was taking place. And so morale was at an all-time low because of all these factors. And then you have a major moment take place with a revolution in Russia. And we will get into this a little bit more next time. And so what you have is that Russia is just like every other country, but worse, they're on the brink of collapse as well. And so because of this, because of the economic woes, the food woes, things like that, in March of 1917, you have what's called the bread riots in St. Petersburg, which are basically what brought down the Russian monarchy. So you'll learn about this a little bit later. Now, whenever the czar, or the king, if you will, stepped down from power, the leader of this movement was a guy named Vladimir Lenin, which we will again talk about tomorrow. Now, when he takes power, the first things he does is what he promised the people, which was get Russia out of the war. And so they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The problem with that is that the two-front war was really what was keeping what's keeping Germany from fully winning, because they were fighting a two-front war instead of a one-front war. And so what you have happen here is now when Russia gets out with this treaty, now they're fighting a one-front war. So things are looking even more bleak. Soon after the Russian Revolution began, another event altered the balance of forces. The United States declared war on Germany. Many factors contributed to this decision to exchange neutrality for war. So let's talk about some of these factors. These are really, the top 2 points are the two big reasons. So you already had the Lusitania happen. That was kind of a stain, but Wilson was able to keep the United States out of the war. But then Germany gets a little bit paranoid. And so they think that the United States is going to get in anyways. And so they reinstitute unrestricted submarine warfare. Okay, now what this did is that this was the idea. They were basically trying to break the stalemate. They were trying to keep the United States out of the war by sinking everything they possibly could. But instead it just simply angered the United States even more. And then you have this moment of like anti-German sentiment growing. Because of really several factors. So the United States shared a cultural history and language with Britain, sympathized with France. Some Americans did favor the Central Powers over the others. But really overall, Americans were getting kind of tired of hearing about the war happening, things like that. And so eventually what really tips the scale in the favor was the Zimmermann telegram. So Arthur Zimmermann was the German foreign minister, and so he sent his ambassador to Mexico, the German ambassador in Mexico, a telegram. And basically he wrote that if Mexico joined the war in favor of Germany, that when Germany won, they would help Mexico reconquer the lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. And so what happened is Britain actually got this telegram, and they sent it to the newspapers first and then to the government. And what this did is that it really changed the sentiment of the war, and Americans were really pushing to get in this war now, because they see, look, this war can come home very quickly. And so Wilson asks for a war to end war. So he basically says at this point, all right, we're getting in. Let's take care of it, and so they'll never have a war again, which obviously didn't happen. Now, when he comes in into the war, he comes in with also what's called his 14 points. And his 14 points is basically like, after this is over, we need to have these 14 things in place that will keep the United States, or keep the world from having another a war that's this destructive. And so Wilson decides that basically self-determination is one of the huge ideas here. So like each country can choose their own path and nobody should be able to interfere. Each people should choose their own path and nobody should interfere. So this is a chart of the 14 points. there was a final showdown on the Western Front that began early in 1918. The Germans badly wanted to achieve a major victory before the eager American troops arrived in Europe. And so you had some early final offenses right before the United States was able to fully get troops on the ground. Okay, Germany led a massive push, and it ended up pushing the Allies back about 40 miles. It was the Germans' biggest breakthrough in really 3 years. And so the rapid push exhausted the German forces, and then it cost them heavy casualties. And really by that point, by the end of that, the fresh American troops were pouring into the Western Front. The Allies launched counteroffensives, slowly driving the forces back through France and Belgium. And in September, German generals told the Kaiser the war could not be won. And so at that point, the Germans asked for peace. Okay. By autumn, Austria-Hungary was also reeling towards collapse. As the government in Vienna tottered, the subject of nationalities revolted, splintering the empire of the Habsburgs, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. So really, by the end of the war, the only central power that was left standing, because Italy had flipped sides, it was really only Germany. And so then they signed an armistice on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, and so the war became an end. Now, the human toll, we're going to look at a chart here in a minute. The human toll was about 8.5 million men died in battle, but more than twice that number had been wounded, and many of them disabled for life. Historians estimate that at least 6 million civilians lost their lives during the war. And on top of that, the devastation was made even worse in 1918 by a deadly pandemic of influenza. The pandemic is the spread of disease across a large area, which is currently what the coronavirus. In just a few months, the flu had killed more than 20 million people worldwide. And so then you also have this economic toll. It cost countries. Countries were on the absolute verge of collapse. And so because of this verge of collapse, countries were wanting payment for the war. And so the Allies really blamed the only standing power, Germany, for the war, and forced them to pay heavy reparations. These reparations ended up being close to like $400 billion in today's money. And then you have political tolls. You had many radicals taking a chance to control the government in they control the governments as that are weak. This is in the early 1900s. This is the chart I was telling you about. Mobilized forces versus killed, wounded, prisoners and missing, total casualties of the war, that type of thing, financial costs. Just a week after the war ended, President Wilson boarded a steamship bound for France. He had decided to go in person to Paris, where Allied leaders would make peace. Wilson was certain he could bring a just peace to the world. Tell me what is right, Wilson urged his advisors, and I'll fight for it. But the Allies end up having conflicting goals at the end of the war. Obviously, France and Great Britain had been in the war much longer. They suffered heavy losses, took a toll on their economy, that type of thing. And so even though Wilson and the leaders of Great Britain and France really, they wanted peace. They all had different ideas. Wilson kind of was a little bit forethought. He's like, look, if we punish Germany, that's going to leave the door open for some radical, tyrannical leader, aka Hitler. It could leave the door open for somebody like that. And the others were like, no, we want punishment. And Germany's the only one that we can actually punish that's still standing today. And so because of that, they really weren't able to fully understand how to get on top of things. Now, one of the things that he was able to get through, Wilson was able to get through from his 14 points, was the League of Nations. And what he decided is that, look, we can't let this happen again. We need to have this idea of collective security, a group of countries that can maintain peace in the world. And so that is what he pushed, and that's what people are like, yeah, that's actually a really good idea. So they discounted a lot of the other things that he said, but they actually liked the idea of the League of Nations. And so then you have the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Germany had not been, Germany and Russia had not been at the table during this whole process. And so in June of 1919, the Allies ordered representatives of the new German Republic to sign the treaty that was drawn up at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris. Now, the German delegates did not like this treaty because it basically forced Germany to assume full blame for causing the war. But you have to remember, they didn't cause the war. They were like the third country in the war. But they were the only one left standing, so they took the brunt of this, and they were forced to sign this. So again, this angers a lot of Germans because they're like, no, we did not start this war. And they made them pay $400 billion in today's money. Now, the Allies drew up separate treaties with the other Central Powers. These treaties redrew the map of Eastern Europe, affected colonial peoples around the globe. Like the Treaty of Versailles, these treaties left widespread dissatisfaction. And so you had several new nations in Europe. And so one of the key points of, like we talked about, of Wilson's was the 14 points was self-determination, the idea that you can create your own. And so you had a lot of countries that were being formed really for the first time. And so you see the split of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You see the split of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, kind of what let the door open for Germany to be basically blamed for all of this. And so you had other countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia. All of those countries were created for the first time. And then you also have the mandate system, which are territories administered by Western powers. So you still had a little bit of imperialism taking place, and really is more for protection this time. But then you still left the door open for widespread discontent. German and colonial peoples were not the only groups dissatisfied. Italy was angry because it did not get all the lands promised in the secret treaty with the Allies. Japan protested the refusal of the Western powers to recognize the claims in China. At the same time, China was forced to accept Japanese control over the former German holdings. And so you had a lot of people who were just frustrated with how things were stood up to the war, but people were so ready for the war to be done, they didn't think about the ramifications. Now, the League of Nations, President Wilson's baby, more than 40 countries joined the League, and which was a big moment for Wilson. Now, what was interesting is that some senators who did not like Wilson, like Henry Cabot Lodge, well, they didn't want to have the United States in the League. They wanted to restrict the treaty. And so what they did is that many of these war-weary Americans simply were okay with that, and Wilson basically had forced to sign the treaty. And so the United States stayed out of it. Now, the United States staying out of the League of Nations ended up hurting it, and the League of Nations ended up failing not too long after this. All right, guys, I know that's kind of long, but it's kind of covering many things in this war. So if you have any questions, please make sure you reach out. Talk with you soon.